A small community in southeast Oregon was thrown into the national spotlight earlier this year when several dozen armed occupiers took control of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, leading to a month-long standoff with law enforcement. They were protesting federal government control of local lands, a long-standing grievance in the American West. But some local residents say they were surprised the conflict took place there because they've been working together to resolve land management disputes. Special correspondent Kat Wise reports.
The Malheur National Wildlife Refuge has reopened to the public, but the headquarters complex remains closed for now.
Once the repairs are done, we're back in the buildings and operational again, then we'll open up the headquarters.
Refuge manager Chad Cargis says that while cleanup efforts from the occupation are ongoing, everyone's attention is now refocused on the most important visitors here: birds.
Malheur Refuge is about migratory birds, and so this basin is one of the most important spring migratory stopover points for migratory birds in the western U.S. The basin serves as kind of like an international airport. It's a hub.
More than 320 species are found here, including sandhill cranes, Ross's geese, long-billed curlews, and red-winged blackbirds. But the birds don't just hang out on the refuge. They land wherever they want. And at this time of year, that's often on local private ranch land, wet with spring runoff. It's wonderful habitat for birds and for cows. Cows outnumber people by 14-1 in Harney County. There's a long, proud tradition of ranching here, and cattle and haying are the main drivers of the local economy. Cows and birds seem to get along quite well on private ranches, and many in the community appreciate the tourism dollars that birders bring in. But it's when those cattle have to graze on public, government-owned land, which makes up about 75% of the county, that conflicts between ranchers and environmental groups and the federal government become evident. So about 10 years ago, refuge manager Cargis and a small group in this community decided to try a fairly novel approach to resolving those conflicts: face-to-face conversations. And those conversations have led to this: the High Desert Partnership, a nonprofit that was formed with one goal: collaboration.
Can you add to the committee, or does it need to be a standing committee?
I would just recommend that it is a standing group.
Participants at this recent meeting, held at the historic Hotel Diamond, included ranchers, federal and local government employees, scientists, and conservation advocates. A diverse group you might not expect would share so many laughs.
Is it kind of our internal document? Correct. Yeah. Okay.
Brenda Smith is the group's director.
We wanted to go beyond litigation when land issues were being challenged, I guess. If we can bring people together, maybe those things wouldn't happen. And that is where we have seen our success.
The group has made progress in other areas too, like reducing the number of invasive carp that are hurting the ecosystem in Malheur Lake on the refuge, and improving flood irrigation systems on private ranches that benefit both cattle and the birds. But how to manage cattle on federal lands, especially on the refuge, is an issue they are still sorting out. Dan Nichols is a local rancher and an elected county commissioner. He's a firm believer in the partnership, but he says it's not always easy to find common ground when ranchers feel their way of life is threatened.
There needs to be some change in the way the federal lands are managed. The West is continually bombarded by threats of monuments, national parks, further restrictions on grazing, the lockup of millions of acres over a succession of time is causing a demise to a certain degree in the rural communities.
Nichols says working through those tough issues has been a lot easier with the partnership in place.
We can sit down and talk. You still don't agree on everything. That's a given. That's people. But you respect one another to listen and to look at the world through their lens a little bit. And others are starting to see, because they've been here enough, that cattle aren't all bad.
Malheur is one of a small number of federal wildlife refuges around the country that allow limited grazing and haying, largely to help control plant growth and invasive species during times of year when the cattle won't impact the birds too much. But when a long-term plan was being developed for the refuge, some hope to get cattle off the land entirely.
We think public lands need to be managed for their ecological value. That needs to be the top priority, and too often those ecological values have been sacrificed for cattle grazing.
Bob Salinger is the conservation director at the Portland Audubon Society. He says cattle cause a number of ecological problems, including trampling vegetation and nests. But after many, many discussions with the group, he decided he could live with some cattle on the refuge.
As we talked, we recognized that we did have some common ground on some of the biggest issues, particularly carp and flood irrigation, that we could agree to move forward on those issues. And also that there needed to be better science in terms of understanding the role that cattle are playing in this ecosystem.
This stuff is shading those plants underneath. And also,
in fact, better science has become the shared goal of the various high desert partners, and they've put their trust in this group. Esther Lev, Dustin Johnson, and Jess Winnick are scientists with different backgrounds, but the three are collaborating on projects around the refuge aimed at understanding how vegetation responds over time to different management tools like flooding and grazing. But what they aren't doing, they say, is taking sides.
We're not trying to dispute this or agree to this. We really are trying to say what goes on here, what's the ideal plant communities that we want and water regime that's going to give the birds the habitat they need.
We're only 2 years really into the sampling that's being done. We're just now beginning to understand some of these changes that we're seeing when we do certain things.
The beautiful thing that I see in this collaborative effort is the value of the shared science. Because too often politics remove some of the tools from the toolbox that you're able to use on a site like this to meet your objectives.
The data from their experiments will ultimately help refuge managers determine how many cattle are allowed to graze from year to year. But not everyone in the larger community is supportive of the High Desert Partnership.
You just hold it and be careful, she'll butt it.
Erin Moppin and her husband Jeff own a 1,700-acre ranch and 350 cattle. They, like so many ranchers in this area, need much more land than they own to feed those cattle. But they say they feel under constant threat that their government permits to graze on public lands will be taken away to preserve habitat for wildlife. Moppin says she participated in early High Desert Partnership meetings, but stopped going after she felt like her views weren't getting traction.
I thought if we could just get the truth out there, that we're not here raping and pillaging the land, that the environmental groups would recognize our grazing rights. I think if people would listen to us more and the collaboration instead of, we're the only ones that has anything to give. And so we're constantly giving and giving and giving.
But those who are committed to the collaborative process say the recent occupation has strengthened their cause. Partnership Director Brenda Smith.
I think it might actually encourage people that, yeah, this is something that's important and that we really need to work hard at it.
The group recently received a $6 million grant from a state agency for wetlands habitat projects on and off the refuge, and they're now collaborating about how to spend that money. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Kat Wise in Harney County, Oregon.